I have two questions. One is, do you also include the Babata and Salome Kumaise papyri?
Babatha. Yes, I would include. I haven't. So I should say again, like what I've started to do hasn't been. Because I haven't got a postdoc yet. These are all ideas for when I can delve fully into it. But Babatha is certainly. And what was the other one?
Salome Kumaise. It's from the same region.
Oh yes.
The desert. Yeah.
I mean, I'm familiar with them, and I will certainly use them because they tell us so much about women's literacy as well.
And my second question is, maybe Greco-Roman inscriptions have lots of abbreviations, like just one letter, for example, standing for a name or an office and so on. Do you think that's also related to make them identifiable more easily by people who know that a certain letter or form stands for something?
Well, that would make so much sense, wouldn't it? Yeah, because there's a special language to how you write inscriptions, and having abbreviations is so much a part of that. I think definitely, yes. Thank you.
Joe? Thank you very much. I suppose there were two things. One, the first is a question. The way you are picturing ordinary people often reading these quite functional texts, so not just lots and lots of completely illiterate people separated from the scribes that write for them, but having to engage with these functional texts. That brings literacy down to a quite mundane and ordinary daily kind of an activity. So where does that leave this rather exalted idea that we have, where we will often say, well, you know, of course, in the ancient times, they could memorize anything, everything. In fact, they all just wandered around memorizing everything, even the Amei Haaretz or the Paul's congregations. It was all in their heads, so they didn't need to read. That's one question. The second one's sort of an observation, which I want to throw in because it's on my mind. When I first started giving papers, when I was a PhD student, I was terrified about facing my first audience. Somebody said to me, have you tried standing at a fence on a farm and giving it to a herd of cows? Because they will come over and they will stand there and just listen. Completely neutral, totally attentive, and they won't interrupt, and they will not criticize you. And you talked about this kind of homogeneous, undifferentiated, opinionless kind of readership that we envisage. So the scribes are always producing stuff for them to digest, and they just take it. And it reminds me very much, actually, of how the audience of Paul's letter to the Romans is. I've recently been thinking, they're so bovine. Paul just writes to them, and they kind of absorb it. It's like they don't have any opinions. So I'm trying to read Romans now as though they actually have a coherent view, and possibly one a bit different from Paul. So that last story was a bit indulgent, but there's two comments.
Aren't there a few other letters in the New Testament? I haven't read the New Testament since I was an undergrad, but there are a few where the audience, the community is less docile.
They emerge, yeah. They emerge. In fact, Drake and Bart will talk about the Corinthian community who are. They know how to assert themselves. Yeah.
You can always discuss whether cows or sheep.
Yes, cows and sheep, yes. With your first question, I think I would certainly agree with Ingo from this morning in that there are very limited uses of writing. And it's kind of like today where I think there's a statistic that in Britain about 10% of the population or so have never read a book from cover to cover. So while these people might also be literate in the modern sense of the word of being able to text each other and read things on the internet, they would never read literature. So, but it's so difficult kind of trying to frame that in conversation about memorization and acculturation and what an educated person is in the ancient world. Because you could be very educated but be a craftsman or be a scribe, and there's all these different forms of literacy, but it's just, I'm still figuring it out in my head and how to find vocabulary for explaining that. But yeah.
Okay. Well, I will follow your postdoc.
Two questions. First, or comments. First, it's really interesting the interaction between scribe and the people who engage them. If I got you right, you had the idea that people already read such things, but especially, for example, from the Aramaic documents from Egypt, we know that probably they were kept with the scribes or in archives and not read by those people who've done it. We know it, for example, because we have archives of small letters, of private letters, and not kept with a private person, but obviously with a scribe, because it's two different people, and they even have ostraca with 3 private letters to different people. So this really shows that the scribe went there, told them, your father died, you have to pay the wine, and they were not kept by those people. This is the first question would be, have you some more information where such things has been kept and used by those who are really concerned with this? And the second question is just out of interest, do you have some information from your area of different level of scribes? So there's a village scribe who is doing these things, and maybe then the scribe who is writing the Homeric texts, and because we have some such notions in the Jewish tradition. For example, I think it's still a Sota. You see, I've read one tractate. Where they say, okay, we have the sages, and then after the temple went down, the sages became scribes, and the scribes became ordinary people, and the ordinary people became nothing. And there we have this certification that there are sages, which probably were literate, and there were scribes, which only were literate, but probably even not very intelligent and normal people. Do we have in your field also such certification of different level of scribes and sages?
Thank you. Thank you so much for your questions. I'll do the second one first. So the different levels of scribes. I think. I mean, there's obviously I can't remember the name of the thesis off the top of my head. Forgot the name. Sorry, yeah. But I mean, there's loads of references to scribes generally, and in the Hebrew Bible, they're always usually sort of administrators. And then after, yeah. But then.
Heat of administration.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Saying of a colleague that probably a scribe never wrote something because he had some people who did.
And then in the Hellenistic period, there's Ben Sira, but I think Ben Sira is exceptional.
He's a sage.
We call him a sage because he's exceptional. He's got such a high degree of learning. He was obviously incredibly popular. The popularity ensured the survival of his manuscript. He winds up at Masada. He gets translated into Greek, kind of like equivalent of Stephen King or something. And stratification, I don't know, honestly. I can only think of examples of the careers of Philo, Josephus, and going later and on, or use some pagans like Libanius, and they do various different things throughout their life. And then I know of one example of Egyptian priests, how they had their tomb biographies, the earliest biographies, and they'll for so many years, so-and-so was like an under-priest, and then he was a slightly less under-priest, and then he went on. And so I imagine there must have been gradations over time as you get seniority, but I don't think we have the evidence for it. And then the first question, so scribes and readers engaging in the keeping of documents, I think by the Hellenistic period, I think it is changing a little bit. But the problem is that in the Hellenistic period, you don't really have the sort of functions of personal communication like letter writing. There's not a lot of letter writing. It's like in exceptional circumstances, somebody died, and like, you go and you write a letter to them, or somebody runs out of money and that, but it's so infrequent. But by Hellenistic period as well, there just seemed to be a lot of, I've made a copy, I'm keeping this copy, and here's your copy as well, which also is interesting because then means you've either got like 2 scribes, or you've got one scribe and he does a couple copies of it, and then is it like a social kind of like activity, or is it just one person and they're dictating to one person?
Yeah, I just want to be in line with what you said. My great-grandfather was a scribe, and that was the reason that he had a rank in the army, because that was a rank in the army to be a scribe, and he deserved a lot of money with it. But so it is always wise to look for different forms of scribes. You can certainly see it in the New Testament. So the word you use in English for scribe, we translate it totally different in Dutch. And so you can see that immediately there are differences.
That's problematic, isn't it?
Yeah, because there are several kinds. And in fact, in your own sources, there are 2 kinds of scribes, because como come out thuis. You can define that it's probably not such a scribe, because he made mistakes, and he's from a scribe from a little village. So in your text already, yeah, possible. But the other guy, he wrote for somebody, but he doesn't get a title. So you see that even in your own material, there are differences.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. Yeah, and there are various names for scribes in Greek, but then I don't know if we can translate to Aramaic-speaking Judea, because it's not the same. There's only like Sofer. But
yes, very, very, yes.
But also in the New Testament, you have really different. You have disciples of the Gammatarians, and there are all kinds of different indications for people who have some knowledge, or maybe a little bit more.
Well, the solution is you call them all Schriftgelehrten, and then they're all the same.
Even that's wrong. Even that's wrong.